Zoe and Blaine enjoy a playful phone call, reminiscing about their past and sharing news from their respective lives. Blaine assures Zoe he will be careful in Mexico City and promises to call her every night. However, his calls abruptly stop. Days turn into weeks, and Zoe becomes increasingly worried, fearing the worst. Finally, she receives a call from Blaine's colleague, Jose. The news is devastating. Blaine went missing after a recent aftershock. Jose reveals that Blaine walked miles every night to find a phone booth to call Zoe, prioritizing her well-being over his own safety. Overcome with grief and guilt, Zoe collapses, realizing the true depth of Blaine's love and the devastating consequences of her own fears. Will Zoe ever be able to forgive herself for her anxieties and their potential impact on Blaine's disappearance? What will happen to the search efforts for Blaine? How will Zoe cope with the loss of the man she loves?
Zoe couldn't tell her mother about her relationship with Blaine, so she just cried silently in her mother's arms. Gloria guessed that Max's situation had taken its toll and just held her daughter, comforting her. In just 2 days, Zoe lost a whole lot of weight. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she hadn't slept for days. It was not because she didn't want to sleep, but because she truly couldn't. She would have loved to fall asleep and forget this waking nightmare, but she was terrified she'd miss a call. Zoe kept the phone in her hand day and night. When Zoe heard the news of Blaine's disappearance, her first thought was to fly to Mexico City and search for him herself. She would find him no matter what. She'd even gone so far as to check the limited flights available. But she realized this was foolish. She needed to stay in Phoenix and look after their son. Zoe had to trust in Jose and the rescue teams that they were doing everything they could to find Blaine. It had been a week, and Zoe had heard nothing. She was about to get off work when she suddenly received word that the St. Mary's team had returned from Mexico City. When Zoe heard the news, she didn't even take the time to pack up her things. She just grabbed her bag and ran out of her office without even saying goodbye to her colleagues. As soon as Zoe arrived at the hospital, she saw a white bus with the emblem of a charity organization parked in the hospital's circular front driveway. Zoe stood at a distance and frantically scanned the group of doctors, grabbing their bags and greeting loved ones, but Blaine wasn't among them. Blaine hadn't come home. The wind blew past Zoe's face, and her eyes blurred with tears. She felt as if she was drowning as she watched the crowd of smiling faces greeting one another. Zoe didn't dare to step forward and ask about Blaine. She just stood there dumbly, not moving at all. She kept imagining seeing Blaine's smiling face among the crowd. She didn't dare to think how she might never see his handsome face again. The phone in Zoe's hand vibrated with a new message. Lowering her head, she wiped her tears to read the message on her phone. When she read the text, Zoe was stunned for a long moment. Then she took off running. Zoe didn't even take the time to get her car out of the hospital's parking lot. Instead, she grabbed a taxi waiting out in front of the hospital. In the taxi, Zoe read the text message over and over. She didn't stop until her eyes were blurry with tears and she could no longer read the words. The text message was simple. Zoe, my house, 30 minutes. The message was from Blaine. His number, his domineering tone. He had returned. He really came back. Zoe was convinced that the taxi she was in was the slowest in existence. When they reached Blaine's building, she was halfway out the door of the cab before it even came to a full stop. She hurriedly handed the driver a 20 and bolted out of the car, not caring to wait for her change. When the elevator doors opened and Zoe saw the familiar tall and handsome figure in front of her, Zoe's eyes instantly became wet. Blaine leaned against the elevator door's frame, curled his lips, and smiled lazily at her. Then, before Zoe had time to react or say anything, she suddenly felt something tighten around her waist as a powerful arm pulled her into a firm chest. Blaine was home. She couldn't hold it in anymore. Zoe burst into tears. Blaine was home. He was safe. Zoe had been so afraid that she would never see Blaine again. She wrapped her arms around him and hugged him tightly. It was as if she was afraid if she didn't hold on, he might suddenly disappear again. Blaine was gratified when he felt Zoe's arms tighten around him, but at the same time, he couldn't help wincing in pain. Her tight embrace aggravated his injury, but he didn't say anything. Although it was painful, being held by her, no matter how much it hurt, was worth it. "Stop crying." Blaine bent over and lowered his head, gently wiping away her tears. Zoe didn't say anything. She just kept crying, venting all of the painful feelings that had haunted her nights and days so much that she barely slept or ate for a week. Now that Blaine was home, Zoe couldn't tear herself away. She stayed in his embrace, unable to let go. Blaine hadn't expected Zoe to cry so much. He wiped tears from her face, each one making an imprint on his heart. With Zoe still in his arms, he walked them over to the sofa, where he laid her down, trapping her between him and the sofa. Zoe was still crying, completely ignoring his actions. She covered her red and swollen eyes with her hands, embarrassed by her inability to stop, but unable to help herself. Blaine reached out and gently moved her hands away from her eyes. "Come, don't cry. Let me have a good look at you first." Zoe cried even harder when she heard this. She weakly slapped him on the chest as all of her pent-up emotions came spilling out. "You lied to me. You promised. You promised me that you would be safe, but then you disappeared. I didn't hear from you for a week. Do you know how worried I was? How scared I was?" Zoe sobbed uncontrollably. She had shed so many tears over this man, but these tears were different. Zoe knew she couldn't be with Blaine, but she couldn't handle the thought of Blaine not being a part of this world, even if he couldn't be a part of hers. Blaine smoothed Zoe's long hair off of her face as he took in the dark circles under her eyes and her pale complexion. Frowning, he told her, "And what about you? Zoe, you also promised that you would take good care of yourself. I was only gone 2 weeks, and you've lost so much weight. And you were already too thin. Is this how you take good care of yourself?" Zoe didn't argue with him because she knew what he said was true. She hadn't been taking care of herself. Zoe returned his gaze with watery eyes, telling him honestly, "I was so afraid I'd never see you again, so I haven't slept at all." "What do you mean you haven't slept at all?" Blaine's face instantly darkened, but his touch was gentle as he softly caressed Zoe's cheek, and his eyes filled with heartache. Zoe's eyes blurred. She hugged his sturdy waist, her small head snuggling into his embrace, and softly whispered, "I'm so sleepy. I really do want to sleep." Blaine was home. He had returned to Zoe's side. With her arms around him, knowing he was with her and safe, Zoe could finally sleep in peace. She faintly whispered, "I can finally sleep." As soon as Zoe finished her sentence, before Blaine could even reply, she fell into a deep sleep. Blaine raised his eyebrows in surprise, looking at her delicate, tear-streaked face, listening to her even breathing, a sound so light and pleasing. At that moment, Blaine knew this woman was his whole world. He knew that regardless of how much he dodged or evaded, he couldn't escape the hold Zoe had on his heart. It seemed that Zoe was destined to be the most important person in Blaine's life. Zoe slept soundly. When she next opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Blaine's handsome face. He slept peacefully beside her in his bedroom, the morning sun reflecting off his tan skin. Zoe couldn't help but reach out her hand to touch him, wanting to assure herself he was real and really home with her. However, before she could, Blaine suddenly woke up and caught her, shackling her small hand inside his big palm. He opened his eyes, which were filled with drowsy heat. He opened his mouth and slightly nibbled on Zoe's hand. With a flip of his body, Blaine pressed her under him. "You're touching me so early in the morning. Why? What do you want to do?" His voice was a little hoarse. Blaine watched her as Zoe stared up at him as if she was trying to determine whether the face in front of her was real. Suddenly, her eyes turned watery again. "Where have you been this past week?" Zoe asked in a pained whisper. Zoe had been so relieved and sleepy yesterday that she hadn't yet asked Blaine what exactly had happened to him. Now that Zoe had slept soundly, she needed to get answers to all of the questions that had been haunting her for a week. Blaine lowered his head and fixed his gaze on the woman beneath him. He placed both hands on the sides of Zoe's head, holding her. He stroked her forehead and cheeks with his thumbs, every touch warm and gentle. His movements were casual, but Blaine acted as if he was caressing the most precious treasure in his life. "Let's not talk about it," Blaine said seriously. "No." Zoe's eyes immediately turned red. She placed her hand over his where he held her head, telling him anxiously, "You're afraid I'll worry." "Be good," he coaxed her. Blaine didn't want to talk about the time he'd spent buried in the ruins of an apartment building. Those long, dark days were something he would remember for the rest of his life. He didn't want to talk about the frustration of facing death and not being able to do anything about it. He had realized that life was so fragile that it could be taken away at any moment, and that there was ultimately nothing anyone could do to escape one's fate. Blaine had nothing to eat and no water, and could only rely on his willpower to persevere. Until a miracle happened. Zoe returned his gaze. She could see the traces of pain in Blaine's eyes, the pain he was trying to mask for her benefit, and she let her questions go. "All right, I won't ask." Zoe nodded obediently and tightened her grip on his large hand. Blaine smiled. "I will tell you how I survived, though." "How?" Zoe asked in surprise. "I wasn't alone. I was trapped with an older man in his 60s who told me how much he missed his wife. She died of breast cancer 10 years ago, still relatively young, and he wished they'd had more time together. His wife had been his first love and soulmate, but they had broken up before finding their way back to one another. The man regretted the time he'd lost with her during those years apart now that she was gone. He asked me about my first love, and I told him our story. Before I finished, we were rescued. As they were carrying him out on a stretcher, the man was still asking me about my love story. He wanted to know how the story ended." As he said this, Blaine raised his eyebrows slightly. He gazed into Zoe's misty eyes and asked her, "What kind of ending do you think I should tell him?" Zoe's heart ached. Her tears were on the verge of spilling out, and she closed her burning eyes to avoid Blaine's intense gaze. She didn't dare look at him. She knew what he meant. Zoe's answer was the end of his story. Her evasion and silence gave Blaine the answer he didn't want to hear. With much difficulty, he sat up from Zoe's body. "You should sleep more. It's the weekend." Blaine's voice was much cooler compared to the warmth of his earlier tone. Zoe watched Blaine wince as he sat up and asked anxiously, "Are you hurt? Why didn't you say anything? Where were you injured? Let me see it." Zoe started to rise to check on his wounds, but he held her down. "Don't move." When Zoe heard this, she became even more nervous. "No, let me see it. Let me help you." Blaine took her hand, not allowing her to move. His sexy mouth hooked into an evil smile. "You really want to see it?" "Yes." "All right, then." Zoe blinked and stammered. What are you doing?" "Showing you my wound. You asked to see it, didn't you? It's still ready and willing, especially after a 2-week break." Zoe quickly looked away and held her hand out in front of her, motioning for him to stop. "No, don't take it out. Stop. I've changed my mind. I don't need to see it anymore." Blaine laughed out loud as he retracted his hand from the waist of his pants. Zoe couldn't help but feel relieved, but she also wanted to smack the smile off Blaine's laughing face for teasing her like that. "You go back to sleep. I'll shower first." Blaine stood, still chuckling, and headed for the bathroom after instructing her to rest. His pace was rather slow. He obviously feared that he would aggravate his wound. His real injury was on his back. Because he had been buried in rubble for 5 days, his wound had become infected and had festered. Blaine didn't want Zoe to see him like that, knowing she would worry too much. Zoe quickly threw off the blanket and got up. "Let me help you." Blaine accepted Zoe's assistance. He put one arm around her shoulders and even pressed all his weight onto her body. He lowered his head and looked at her, revealing a teasing smile. "Is this okay?" "Blaine, how much do you weigh exactly?" Zoe resentfully asked, panting a bit from exertion. "Not much, only twice as much as you." Blaine subtly moved his body a little away from Zoe to help her. "Zoe, you have to put some weight on. You need to be stronger. I'm worried when we do it, I might break your little body in two." Blaine's blunt words flustered Zoe, and she angrily swatted his hand away in embarrassment. How can someone who looks so noble be so crude? Faced with Zoe's accusation, Blaine chuckled softly and didn't even deny it. Instead, he suddenly grabbed Zoe by the waist and lifted her onto the bathroom counter. Zoe was exasperated. "What are you doing? First you're hobbling around like you're seriously injured, and now you're so energetic. Are you pretending?" "I'm just putting you to work. You wanted to help me." Blaine hugged Zoe's waist with one arm and supported himself on the sink with the other hand. He tilted his face towards Zoe and said coolly, "You're going to help me shave." "Huh?" Zoe looked at him in surprise, as she clearly felt her heart skipping a beat. "I can't do that. I've never, shaved a man before." Zoe shyly refused. Blaine smiled at her statement. He was glad that Zoe had never done this for Matthew before. "Even better," he said out loud. "It's about time you learned." He took the shaving cream, handed it to Zoe, and placed his razor in her other hand. Since she was already in position, Zoe knew it would seem a bit unreasonable if she refused him again. She opened the can of shaving cream and tentatively sprayed some into her hand. She then patted it onto Blaine's stubble and lifted his razor. "Am I doing it right?" "Yes." Blaine praised her. "Now, just don't accidentally slit my throat with that razor and you'll get a gold star."
Zoe, trembling slightly, carefully guides the razor across Blaine's jawline. He watches her intently, his eyes filled with a mixture of amusement and something else, something deeper. "You're doing well," he murmurs, his voice a low rumble against her skin. Zoe's heart races. What is this strange pull between them? Is it just relief and lingering fear after his disappearance, or something more? And what secrets does Blaine still hold? Will Zoe ever learn the truth about his ordeal? Hi, Zoe here. If you are wondering what happens next, then download the Pocket FM app and listen to the exciting episodes of Rekindled Heartache now.